afternoon, dear viewers. I am Dr. Ranjana Das, Associate Professor from the Department of History, Ramjas College, University of Delhi. I am discussing today the topic Understanding the History and Scope of Museums in India. In the first part of my lecture, we discussed what is meant by museums, the relevance, significance and purpose of having museums in our countries, in our regions, for our cultures, for our natural heritage and so on and so forth. We looked at the definition of what is meant by museum. And the scope of museology, the discipline, the scientific discipline which studies museums. And we also looked at the evolution of museums in the Western context, how museums emerged in the West largely with the arrival of the modern nation states. Now let's look into the next part of our lecture where we focus on the history and scope of museums in India. Here I have divided my lecture into two parts. One is we look at the emergence of museums, the evolution of museums in the colonial context, because India was a British colony for over 2 centuries, and within the colonial context we will divide our lecture into two parts. One is the period when India was under the East India Company before the revolt, till before the revolt of 1857, and after India, post the revolt and uprising of 1857, after India was transferred directly to the British Crown, and that became another watershed moment in the history of colonial India. And finally we look at the emergence of museums, the formation of museums in independent India in the post-colonial period. And lastly, we look at the different types of museums which are there in India, and also some of the recent interventions in the field of museology and museum studies in India. That's a picture of the, if you look at the slide, it's a picture of the Bahrut Gallery, the rails which are kept in the Indian Museum, in National Museum in New Delhi. It's a picture from the gallery, and Bahrut rails were basically, part of the Bahrut Stupa, which was discovered by Alexander Cunningham, one of the British officers who was very interested in collection of artifacts, and he also began the Archaeological Survey of India before they were relocated to the museums. Museums in India, if we see, of course, originated in the modern context in the 18th century under the colonial state. But just like we have seen in the Western context, there are some interesting early references to Chitrashala, which may be understood as picture galleries that are found in ancient Indian literature. So on the Behrut rails, which we just saw, in the previous slide, there are these representations of Buddhist Jatak stories. And these stories provide testimony to the fact that perhaps there were open air museums which were in existence as early as 2nd century BC in India. Next, we also see that in the medieval period, there are also records of royal antiquarians collecting objects of curiosity to embellish their palaces. So we find, for example, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, of the Tughlaq dynasty in the Delhi Sultanate period. He was very interested in some of these objects of curiosity, and he actually got transported 2 of the Ashokan pillars to Delhi. If you would know, one is in the Qutub Minar complex and the other is in the Kamla Nehru Ridge, which is very close to the North Campus of Delhi University. So we do see that, in the ancient as well as in the medieval period, there were these individual acts of interest towards collecting, items of antiquity, items of curiosity by individual rulers or members of royalty and nobility that we get to see. Yet the museum, the concept of museum, the idea of museum that we are familiar with today certainly did not exist either in ancient or in medieval India. Because the museums that one is familiar with today is largely open, believes in public access, believes in the generation of a certain kind of a corpus of knowledge which is meant for the public. So this was certainly not there in the ancient or the medieval period. Kavita Singh, who has worked on the, how museums were formed and evolved in the colonial period, Interestingly, she points out that the initial purpose of establishing museums in India by the colonial rulers was an importation of the European logic with an additional colonial purpose to control knowledge. So she said that there are two purposes. One is certainly importation of the European logic of museums as repositories of the culture, the traditions, knowledge of a particular nation or region, and therefore, they need to be curated as and exhibited as, as representation of a body of knowledge. And secondly, and most importantly, she says in the colonial context, this knowledge so produced but also meant to control. So knowledge therefore produced was meant to control the colonial minds. The kind of knowledge that is produced, the act of curation, the act of selection, the manner of exhibition, the kind of interpretation was also an attempt to formulate a knowledge that would be taught to the colonized people, to the indigenous people about their own history, but of course through the colonial lens. So she said that this is not just a knowledge for control, but it is also knowledge control per se. How knowledge that is being produced by the colonial rulers and being taught and shared with the colonized people or the indigenous community also has an element to control their minds. So it's a very, very interesting intervention made by Kavita Singh in her study of museums in colonial India. Now, like I said that, I'm going to divide this section into two parts, the colonial context in the pre-1857 period and the colonial context in the post-1857 period with the transfer of power to the, British, Empire. The earliest museum that the Britishers established is believed to be the India Museum that was established by the East India Company in London in 1801. So we know that until the revolt of 1857 or the uprising of 1857 happened, India, the various parts of India were controlled and governed by the East India Company, which was a private business company of the British Empire who had initially come to India. And whatever in the course of their exploring India, being posted in various parts of the country, in course of various kinds of confrontations, sometimes they would be able to amass these artifacts. Sometimes the colonial officers or the officers of the East India Company would also be intrigued and interested in these objects of curiosity that they are finding in the alien land while they are being posted in various places. So these objects would be collected by them, and more often, they would be, transported to to London where they were staying. And because they were transported to London, so at some point of time it was decided that, out of all these collections that were sent by the East India Company officials, an India Museum could be formed, which was eventually formed in 1801. Now, what were the composition of these collections? They ranged from various types. They were collections of scientific samples, they were manuscripts, they were antiquities, they were objects of curiosity, as well as military loot. So we know that, during the time of revolt of 1857 or the mutiny or the uprising of 1857, as we would like to call it, many of these British officers, in terms of opposing the Mughal emperor, they would be looting a lot of these artifacts that were, there in the palaces and wherever they could accumulate. So all these, they are just one of the examples. So all these were objects of interest for the East India Company officers, and these collections were later on put together and exhibited in the form of a museum that was established in London. So this is the earliest museum that one can consider in terms of the artifacts of where the artifacts of India, the culture of India was represented in the colonial context. The India museums later on, of course, eventually in around 1878, the East India Company is ultimately dissolved, and with the dissolution of the East India Company, eventually the India Museum is also dissolved. And when the India Museum was dissolved, then all its collections were dispersed into various museums which were there in the, in London, in various other parts of London. And right now, they form the core of the Indian material which are kept in the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and also the India Office collection of the British Library. So all the Indian artifacts that we get to, that are exhibited or that we get to witness whenever we are visiting these museums in London, they are largely the dispersed collections of the India Museum, which was eventually dissolved around 1878. By the time the mutiny or the uprising of 1857, which brought the company rule to an end in India, by that time there were museums in most of the capital cities of British presidency, such as Calcutta, Madras and Bombay. So in most of these, capital cities, which were part of the East India Company rulership, had some form of the museums. But these museums, interestingly, it must be noted that they were not started by the government, but they were actually initiated through private, individuals or groups. So they were not museums that were started by the government, but they were initiated through private initiatives. Let's look at what were these, which museums were established. So for example, there was the Indian Museum in Calcutta, which was started by the Asiatic Society. The Government Museum in Madras, which owes its origins to the Madras Literary Society. The Victoria and Albert Museum, which has now been renamed as Dr. Bhau Daji Lad Museum in Bombay, which was again started by a circle of private individuals. So very interesting to note that most of these museums were not established, were not initiated, were certainly continued under the British rule later on, but they were not initiated directly under the interest or aegis of the government, but were largely initiated through private interest groups. In each case, when these collections that were built by these private societies became extremely unwieldy and difficult to handle, they would then appeal to the government to take them over and to maintain them. Again, very interesting to note that more often the government would not be very, very interested to sort of take them over, and in some cases it often took a long period of time. There were delays in, before these museums, were actually taken over by the government. We next move on to the next section, which is how museums, developed under the British Raj. So in the earlier part, we looked at how the emergence of museums in India in the modern context happened in the colonial context, but of course, to begin with, while it was under the East India Company. Post 1857, we know that there was a transfer of power from the East India Company to the British Crown, whereby India became part of the British Imperial Empire. And it is at this point of time that we see that a coherent museum policy emerged after the transfer of power of the Indian state to the British Crown. So a kind of a very distinctive museum policy was kind of begun at this time. But again, interestingly, we know that, India was a colony and the Britishers had colonial imperial interests in India. So the museums that were set up in the initial 50 years of the British Raj were primarily economic or industrial museums, whose remit was to collect samples and information about any item or process in India that had potential use. So because India was a colony and the purpose of colonizing India was predominantly economic in nature, therefore the attempt to to construct museums were largely with the economic purposes, So for example, silk, cotton textiles, beverages, so all kinds of things. There was a curiosity and interest to know the background knowledge with the purpose of not only knowing, the artifact or the practice, but also the object was also economic in nature, marketability in nature. A distinctive turning point, however, came with the arrival of Lord Curzon in the early 20th century. We know that, we are familiar with the name of Lord Curzon, in case of partition of Bengal. But it's very important to know that Lord Curzon was also an antiquarian. He was deeply interested in the monuments, in the protection of monuments, in the collection of artifacts, and therefore when he took over, under him the Archaeological Survey of India was actually reorganized into a fairly permanent institution. So as the nomenclature itself says, as Kavita Singh talks about, that it's called a survey, so which has a kind of a temporality attached to its function. But with the coming in of Lord Curzon, the ASI, the Archaeological Survey of India, became more of a permanent institution. The other very, very important aspect of the ASI was the fact that it was incumbent with the task of not just studying, but also to protect the monuments of India. So it was not just to, accumulate or acquire these artifacts or these objects of curiosity from the perspective of studying them and producing knowledge about them, but the idea, the purpose was also to protect them. All right, and very, very interestingly, these were to be protected in situ, which basically means that if you're excavating a particular site, you will not relocate or displace the objects which are discovered at the site of excavation to a distant place, because the relevance of the object is more in terms of understanding it in that context. So therefore, it became very, very critical to to protecting them in situ, and also the fact that in terms of relocation, sometimes these objects which were very old and ancient objects, they would also be destroyed. So in that sense, protection in situ is something that Lord Curzon had really emphasized upon. Now let's move on to the next part of it. So we've now talked about how museums were formed and established in the colonial period, and again we divided the colonial period into two parts. In the first part, we looked at how the museums were established largely through private initiatives during the period of East India Company rulership, and then we moved into the next part post 1857, when there was a transfer of power from East India Company to British Crown, and how a coherent museum policy was pursued and very distinctive interventions in the realm of formation of museums and preservation of monuments and preservation and conservation of artifacts was undertaken. With this, we move on to the next section, which is museums in the post-colonial era. Now, after India acquired its independence in 1857, in this section, I would really like to focus on how the National Museum was formulated, and then I go into discussing the various types of museums. So the establishment of the National Museum in fact marks inauguration of a post-colonial era in the cultural life of a new nation. So the coming in of the National Museum is a watershed, a historical watershed in the history of India, because it marks an independent achievement for an independent nation state, that was India, after the end of British rulership. The museum stands very prominently, as we know, as many of us must have visited, in the ceremonial heart of New Delhi's Capitol complex, and its galleries present the history of Indian art through a succession of masterpieces. So, if we have visited the museum, we know that there are various galleries right from the Harappan civilization to the Guptas, the Mauryas, the Satavahanas, to the medieval period, the Sultanate period, the Mughal period. There's also a gallery on the ethnological aspects, on the tribal and indigenous communities, on music. There are various galleries. So all these galleries are, represent masterpieces which are kept in the museum, and they certainly add, a lot of pride to the Indian nation in terms of representing its culture and history. However, interestingly, one must note that National Museum is the culmination, in fact, of a colonial plan for an imperial museum at the same spot. The initial collection with which the museum was started or inaugurated was in fact gathered not for the National Museum, but for a great exhibition of Indian art in London. Now, after the First World War, rather in the interwar period between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, there were a lot of proposals of various kinds of museums to come up, and largely a focus was also on in situ museums, which had been emphasized since the time of Lord Curzon. But we see, and ultimately we see that there was a proposal made by Edward Lutyens, who was the architect of New Delhi, the capital, that we are familiar with. Edward Lutyens, in fact, had a plan for 4 museums to be constructed in the heart of Delhi. And the idea, the architectural pattern was such that, between the Kingsway was largely the route from the Viceroy's Palace, which was later converted into the Rashtrapati Bhavan post, independence, and the India Gate, which is where the which commemorates the the sacrifice of the Indian soldiers in the First World War. So the route in between was the Kingsway, and in the mid way to the Kingsway, there was to be these 4 quadrants, and in these 4 quadrants, 4 museums were conceptualized. One was the Records Office and War Museum. Second was the Medical Museum. Third was a proposal for an Ethnological Museum, and the fourth was an Imperial Museum. The idea behind conceptualizing all these 4 museums were basically that these museums would be a culmination of the knowledge that the British Raj had acquired through its rulership in India. Now, eventually, of course, it leads to the Second World War, and this plan does not happen. At the same time, there was a plan for a fantastic exhibition to be organized in London, where all the Indian objects of Indian arts were to be exhibited in. That was again, conceptualized in 1939, but it got disrupted with the outbreak of Second World War. So all these plans could not be executed. It became executed only after India became independent, and interestingly, the National Museum that we are familiar with, was ultimately constructed in exactly the same spot where the Imperial Museum was conceptualized by Edward Lutyens. Out of the 4 museums that Edward Lutyens had thought about, had imagined to construct, there was another museum, that was constructed, which is your National Archives, which was basically the Records Office converted. Now, these artifacts with which the National Museum was initially, started off, this was largely part of the exhibition that was planned to be organized in 1939, but was eventually disrupted with the outbreak of the Second World War. Finally, in 1948, after India acquired its independence, the exhibition of the art of India and Pakistan came to be held in Royal Academy from November 1947 to February 1948. And this represented an enormous collection of the British and the Indian collections, both public as well as private. The Indian loans to the exhibition when returned in 1948. So post the exhibition, when they were returned to India, on the recommendation of the new Prime Minister of India, Sri Jawaharlal Nehru, he put up for a temporary exhibition at the Viceroy's Palace, which had become the Rashtrapati Bhavan after India acquired its independence. So these artifacts, which were returned post the exhibition in London, they were temporarily put up for exhibition at the at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. The exquisite collection of masterpieces from private and public collections from all over India was then considered by the Prime Minister and Education Minister Sri Maulana Azad to be held permanently for the purposes of a new National Museum proposed to be built at the site of Lutyens, Lutyens had earmarked for the museum complex. So this is how the National Museum was constructed, formulated with the initial, artifacts which were, put up in exhibition in London and later returned. And these artifacts were not returned to the, various other museums, and they were basically put up for the initial collection, of exhibition in the National Museum. In the next part, we look at all the types of museums in India. There are over 700 museums of different kinds of in India. And these divisions are based on the pattern of organization, administration of the museums, and they may be broadly classified based on this into various categories. So those are various kinds of museums. There are museums of national importance. For example, the Indian Museum in Calcutta, the Victoria Memorial Hall again in Calcutta, the Salar Jung Museum Museum in Hyderabad. All these museums were largely or completely supported by central government, although in some cases their administration was local. Then you have the various state museums which are maintained by various states of India. We also have around 43 archaeological site museums. So wherever these archaeological excavations happened around, there are in situ museums, about the artifacts excavated and discovered there, which are maintained largely by Government of India, such as at Sarnath, Hampi, Bodh Gaya, Nalanda, etc. And the idea was not to shift it. All right. So these are pictures of the different archaeological museums. We also have the anthropological site museums, which are largely ethnological, museums. There are memorial museums, university museums, specialized museums, of the departments of maintained by the various departments of center and state governments, such as the National Gallery of Modern Art. So these are all very distinctive kind of cultural patterns which are maintained, within the corpus of museum. There is also science and technology museums, and that apart museums also run by societies and trusts and private bodies, as well as various private museums. Very briefly, we look into the corpus of new museology. Like we talked about new museology in a general context, this is a document which was accepted as a policy in the Guwahati Declaration in December 1988 at a conference organized by the Indian Museum Association, where the attempt was to shift the importance of museum from being a storehouse of various collections to becoming a dynamic cultural center. The attempt was to more of community engagement and also public interaction. As examples, there are various new kinds of museums which are coming up, but as examples, there are works on these two, very interesting museums. One is the Majuli Eco Museum, which allows visitors to experience the distinctive local culture and traditions. Majuli is one of the largest riverine islands of Brahmaputra river in Assam, and it has a distinctive culture and also ecological practices which are built into a concept of eco museum, where the visitors can visit the place and experience the culture of that place. The other example would be the Eco Park Solar Dome. It's a renewable energy museum constructed within a huge ecological park. These are some of the suggested readings that one can look into. Therefore, we have looked into various aspects. We come to an end to this lecture. We have looked into the various aspects of museums, starting from how museums were conceptualized, what is the meaning and relevance of museums, how they emerged in the Western context, the history of museum in India in the colonial and the post-colonial context, the various types of museums which are there in India, and also the scope of new museology in India. I hope you have got some sense of how the history and the scope of museums are to be understood in largely in the context of India. Thank you very much.